Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We're continuing our Language of Creation book club, and hopefully, people have been finding this useful. I don't see Manuel here today, so I guess I've got to do some of this instead of Manuel. We were reading, was it 8 through 13 for this preparation here, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. So first, we want to go around and talk about intentions from last time and what your sort of intention is this time. So, Elena, would you like to start since you're just right here in order for me?
Sure, I can start. The intention I set at the end of our conversation last week was to work on. We talked a bit about abstract principles and then putting them into concrete propositions, and my intent was to work on doing that with my language by being more precise with my speech, and I think I'm going to keep that one for this week.
Okay.
Gustav.
Christopher, you're up next. Do you want to
Yeah, I don't know. My intention for this time?
Well, what's
know.
your roll up from last week? Did you succeed in your last intention, and then you can go into what you intend this time? If it changes.
My last intention, I was like continuing to try to take better notes while reading it, which I somewhat succeeded in. So probably keep up more of the same thing and get even better now that we're getting into more interesting stuff in the book than just introducing whatever's supposed to be happening.
Great. Okay. Gustavs, you're up, sir.
I didn't participate last time, but I watched the video quite carefully, the recording, and the intention that I set out for myself was to be more open and be able to submit myself to the higher principle when it comes onto me, and that's difficult because I didn't know if I would spot it even if right, but I think I was successful.
And what's your intention this time? If it's changed or same thing?
Well, I think my intention this time is a lot more closely related just specifically to this book club, because I think that this book club and this book is very, very important. And I want to specifically be paying a lot of attention and effort to it. Yeah.
Great. Danny?
I don't remember my intention last week. I had 4. One of them was as participating in a wisdom practice. I'll just leave that. I think this week I've had difficulty talking to lots of people over basic concepts and categories. Just lots of failure to be able to agree on how concepts are established. There's lots of just fundamental things like about attention and memory and things that different people with different perspectives may not have. But just even just very basic conversations, I just have like devolved into totally unproductive, arguments over definitions of things. That's something that's been happening a lot. This is kind of a perennial problem, but that's something that's been coming up a lot this week, where I've been observing these conversations and seeing that undergirding a lot of this dysfunction is there's many common themes that exist partially in this book. So that's something that's been happening. And then I have a secondary intention, which is sort of an overarching intention, which is there's a lot of stuff from Dharmic traditions, like from Eastern perspectives, that I think can be connected to. There's lots of useful tools and perspectives that can be mapped and connected in useful ways that I think are less represented in certain spheres. So that's something. So building out my ability to speak about those things is a secondary intention, and bridge the two worlds a little bit and have better conversations. So that's it.
Great. Okay. Well, yeah, the whole breakdown, and which is going to continue and accelerate, by the way. I talked about that in my live stream yesterday on navigating patterns. Yeah, that's Boy, that's going to get worse, unfortunately. Yeah, so I mean, my intention, as always, is to sort of participate in this and see what what comes out for me and how I can help other people sort of see the things that maybe they missed. And so far so good. Seems to be going okay. I will continue that. Um, yeah, let's dive in. Does anybody have any notes or points they want to bring up in these chapters that we can go off of? No,
I mean, yeah, I do.
Oh, go ahead. Bring them up then, please. We can go off your notes.
Okay, so the first point that I wanted to maybe bring up is about how in the diagram. So just for reference, chapter 8, page 31, there's the diagram of the abstract principle coming down and informing. Yes, thank you, and informing the concrete examples. And in the middle, maybe show the other page. The
Which
back
30?
half of what. Yes, that one exactly. And so in the middle, they come together in the symbol. I wanted to point out that the concrete examples and the abstract principle have nodes given to them, but the symbol doesn't itself, which I think
Right.
is quite a good way of showing that the symbol or the object, it doesn't have an existence in itself, but it has existence in relation to the principle and the examples. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I would go back to, of course, my stuff. I would say, yeah, there's no item or thing in the world without a relationship to the material side and the ethereal side, right? Or the spirit. In this book, it's spirit, right, and material. It's the meeting of those two things that not only conveys meaning, but also all the possible identities, right? Which is why if you change the context, the meaning changes, right? Because the context is fundamental to meaning, right? It's not just words mapped to other words, as the postmoderns might have you believe, but they're just a bunch of liars. So that's easy. Yeah, and I think you're right. This exemplifies that. And he also, I mean, there is the whole section, right? That we sort of left off at 7 with marks and symbols, right? And 8 is carrying on from that. Like symbols are part of this marks as such, plus the heavenly principle. So yeah, that's a good observation.
I have a question about that because I understood it, I think, completely different. I mean, opposite. So when Peterson, for example, talks about the border between chaos and order, he says that that is where meaning is found. So, and you guys are saying that meaning is within the two opposites and then not within the symbol?
Well, I wouldn't say they're opposites. I mean, the symbol is where chaos and order meet. Is that's how I would say it? Because I don't. I mean, yeah, you can frame this as being at odds with Peterson in some sense pretty easily if you want, but you don't have to. You can also just go in and say, oh, okay, this is different, right? This is just a different way to think about it. Oh, and here we get a comment from our audience: live, ergodic, or die. Or live ergodic or die, I guess. Another way to think of it is balance. The border between chaos and order is the sacred. I'm not going to disagree with that, I guess. I don't like that definition of sacred, but it's again, one of the problems we have is binary thinking, see navigating patterns, right? And we're thinking of two things because it's easier for us, but actually there's never two things. And once you understand that, that's re-enchanting the world for you. Oh, it's always three, at least. It's like, oh, right, because there's always that border, right? And the border in and of itself becomes a thing. And in this case, the border symbol, I think, is the way I'd say it. What do you think, Gustav? Does that match what you were?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does, and I think it's important where you place that border, because if we look at these symbols as a hierarchy, and if um and if we focus our vision on one of those components, on one of those concrete examples, then that in turn becomes the symbol and has this abstract principle above it and these things below. So it's a fractal, it's a hierarchy, and I'm not sure. So maybe this is a bit well, all of it's abstract, but do you think it's possible to, let's say, like, focus our vision on two things in the hierarchy at the same time? Like,
Not if it's
does that make
focused.
any sense?
No, you can absorb two things at the same time, but now you're unfocused. And there's a big advantage. I mean, when you're in the woods, right, that's what you want to do. You want to switch between focused and unfocused attention. And there's a reason for that, right? So I was walking out. What I tend to do when I walk out my door is I tend to look towards my pond, because something often moves when it sees me, right? I want to catch it, right? And today I wasn't paying super close attention. I mean, I looked towards the pond, but I was walking to the other side of the house, and I wasn't paying super close attention to that. I was actually looking at the ground, and a deer gets up in the woods and like scurries off. And I'm like, well, it's late in the morning for deer. And he was alone, which I was like, oh, poor deer's all alone. Right. But I didn't see him ahead of time because my attention was focused in the wrong place and it wasn't generalized. And so, like, practicing sort of the meditative walking and things like that John Vervaeke talks about is all about unfocused attention, right? It doesn't mean you stay in that state, but there's a big difference between unfocused attention and focused attention. And in unfocused attention, you can kind of pay attention to things. And we do this sub or unconsciously, by the way, right? We have a reptilian or lizard brain. And that's why car accidents don't happen literally all the time. Because when I was young, I was like, those two cars should have hit each other. Why didn't they? Well, it turns out that your brain has a mode where it just objects in motion. And that's what it sees. And that's happening in the background, by the way, while you're, quote, conscious. It's kind of scary. And so you don't run into things, but that's very unfocused attention because it can't tell you the color of the car. It just knows car moving towards me, swerve, right? And that's an unfocused style of attention where there's no detail, right? Where there's very few details, just large object. You probably don't even know the exact size of it because you don't need to know the exact size of an object to avoid it, right? You just have to get close enough. And if you're not close enough, you just swerve more, right? Like, so you do that while walking, you do that while driving, right? And some people have more precision at that than others. But yeah, it's the unfocused versus focused attention. Elena, are you all set, or are you more confused?
I will think about it and I'll get back to you, but I don't know.
Okay.
I think what just threw me off is Gustav saying that the symbol itself was not. Yeah, we can move on. I'll think about it.
Okay, good. Well, that's what we're here for. So, what else you got, Gustav, or does anybody else have?
Going off also what Gustav said there about the diagram he was mentioning, seemed to me he mentioned the thing that you have the meaningless matter that's being informed by the spirit, whatever, and that reminded me of kind of like that's the pattern of creation in Genesis, where you create the space and then fill it, and then create a space and then fill it, and that's.
I think that kind of ties into one of the questions I had, because the way you phrased that was create a space and then fill it. So the space comes first, and then that which fills it is after. So he says that a symbol is a collection of facts expressing a spiritual identity, and the implication that I got here is that the spiritual identity precedes the expression of it. So does that put a primacy on the spiritual expression, or is thinking of it temporally not the correct frame?
What do you mean by temporally?
Like, I'm saying first or prime, but like, I feel like that is limiting the way that I could understand it in the fact first or yeah. I don't know if seeing it as in time as something coming before something else is the correct way to see it.
I mean,
So I guess
I
my
think spirit precedes matter. That the principle precedes the expression, I would say.
is that what he's saying in the chapter 8 and 9 and 10? Did everybody get that as well? Because I guess that makes sense, but then it gets into the idea that he also makes the claim that matter is completely meaningless, and then
Yes.
meaning is purely found in
Yep.
the spiritual,
Yep.
which also I completely didn't understand, as I don't. Is that why matter is able to have identity, because the spiritual precedes it? Because otherwise it would just be not
Yes.
like we wouldn't even, I wouldn't have a category for it at all.
Yeah, I think actually we want to go right back to where we were here, right? What we want to hold on, I'm gonna figure out how to do this. All right. What we want to say is the idea here on the side with inform, knowledge, and express. It's probably not coming through very well because this camera won't focus correctly, but so it's inform, right? Knowledge is in the middle, and express is below, right? And so the meaning doesn't have expression without the material, and the material doesn't have identity without the meaning. And that's probably the easiest way for me to think about it anyway. I don't hopefully that helps you, right? So you've got these two things and they're separated. Right? One's up high and one's down below, right? Roughly in the symbolic way of expressing this. And then identity exists as the result of, we'll say, pulling those two things together, right? Or connecting those two things in that way. That's why he's using all these diagrams with, one node at the top and two at the bottom and a nexus in the middle, right? And then that's the pattern. That's the self-similar fractal pattern, right? And then what's in the middle and what's at the top and what are the things below are the things that matter. And I think also, again, right, that's three things. Well, it's really four, right? There's a fourth thing as the result of the three things. So that's kind of important. Plato might have known about that. And I think that's the secret, if you will, to understanding the cosmology involved here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a bit. So it would make sense to say that the category of the unknown can be seen as a category only because the spiritual principle of that category precedes any type of concrete understanding of it.
I don't know that I'd place the unknown as a category. I would say the unknown are all the things that don't yet have category.
But we still can talk about it, so it must be a category that has some type of border around it. No?
No, I would say it's everything outside the border of all the categories you know. Right, and it's a reference to a potential instead of a reference to an actual. That's the way I would frame it. That's why everybody's upset by unknown unknowns, right? Because they don't like, the framing and the instance are both unknown, and they get upset and they go, oh, that's a stupid thing to say. It's like, no, that's the most important thing you need to understand, because that's where all potential and miracle exists, technically.
Yeah, but we still have the category and the capacity to talk about that unknown and make assumptions about it.
No, we don't. That's the whole point of it being unknown, is you can't. I mean, this is. I mean, if you really want to understand this, you got to read Nassim Taleb, but this Black Swan, where he right, because the example of the Black Swan, that might be his best book, but all of his books are so good that it's pointless to only read the one. But the whole point of Black Swan is everyone's running around going, swans are white, swans are white, swans are white, and then one day somebody finds something that is definitely a swan, but also black. Right. And the problem was that was an unknown, and no one could talk about it because obviously all swans were white, because that's how they define swans. And like, you have to define things. So fair enough. So they come up with this thing outside of the category simply because of the color. No other difference between a black swan and any other swan. Right. But what that means is it is unknown if there was a purple swan or a blue swan or a teal swan. It's just unknown, and we can't really talk about it. We can make stuff up, and fair enough, we make stuff up all the time. Like, I've got my purple talking unicorn, but we can't really talk about it because like it's not manifest, right? We can imagine about it, we can speculate about it, we can sort of theorize about it, although that's really just fantasy with a fancy scientific name. We can do that, but realistically, there are unknown unknowns, and that's where miracles come from, and that's why that's important. Like, specifically, I did want to read this. So, live or gradic or die. So there's no need for one to necessarily precede the other in time. Maybe, but I think Gustavs is onto something when he says it has to precede it in sequence, and that's in the book. Like, that's definitely here. No question about it. It's in both books.
Yeah, there's like
and the,
so
and the core
so
reference.
maybe so this is like the question of the linearity of time, right? And
Yep.
how like certain things that happen afterwards can sort of be the foundation of things that preceded in linear time, like how the cross is the foundation of the world, even though something happened before that. Kind of, it's
Yeah, and I think it's hard for us because we live in time and we can't really talk about not time. So Zero Carton, the only category of the unknown as groups is usage of the word unknown to refer to it. Right. In other words,
Yeah, and that
but per se,
bothers
it is not a categorization. It is an anti-categorization. And I think that's correct. There's no common element other than the fact that we don't know about it. Right. And maybe we can't, like the
that
unknown
fact
unknown.
feels-
Well, but the unknown unknowns, and this is why people are uncomfortable with it, implies that you can't know about it. And I think that's true. There are lots of things you can't know about. And there's some things like you can know about this or this, but not both, because we have limits. Like, we just have cognitive limits.
I understand, where you're coming from. I guess it just bothers me that we still are able to have that abstract category, which feels like a spiritual principle.
It bothers everybody. Like that's I started there. Like, no, unknown unknowns bothers everybody. But in the what I call the age of gnosis, right? Because that's the problem, is that we think knowledge is like this highest value, and therefore if everything isn't knowable, like that's a big problem for our worldview. It's a big problem for my worldview because I love ignorance. It allows me to learn, but whatever. I guess other people say they like to learn, but when it comes right down to it, they also say they have nothing to learn. So, right. And yeah, I mean, just to riff a little bit on category, just because it is one of my favorite topics. It seems to me that the ancient Greeks understood categories or ontologies as philosophy. And so philosophy is the bucket for all possible ontology or categorization, right? And so that would be closer to our current definition of science, but their definition of science was just the natural sciences. So when we talk about science, that's closer to what they talked about as natural philosophy. right? So it's a subtype of philosophy, but also it's very clear from reading the Republic in particular that this does not encompass the world at all. Like philosophy does not encompass the world. It helps you with logic, reason, rationality, and the world's way bigger than that. So, and all the important things are not there. Also, seems to me that's what the ancient Greeks are saying, right? So, categorization is philosophy to them. That's my thesis. I mean, we can argue about whether or not I'm right, but like that's going to be where I'm going to stand on that forever. Oh, and Livergotic or dialects. Yeah, I always thought it was obvious, and I thought everybody knew this, so I apologize. I didn't tell everybody, but also no one listens to me anyway, so it wouldn't work. But I'm glad you like it. Yeah, I don't know where other people. I don't even know where I got that from. I'm sure somebody pointed me in the right direction, probably like my stepfather or something. But yeah, and Marcus Shearer, unknown unknowns is relevant in economics too. It's relevant everywhere, I would argue. It's one way of describing the impossibility of a planned economy. True, right. But it also points to the ways certain economic systems, i.e. markets, can adapt. Yes, still all economists are frauds, except a handful of them. I'm still with Taleb on that. Ray is not with us this time. In the, quote, Lost World of Genesis 1, John H. Walton proposes a unique interpretation of the creation account in Genesis. His key propositions regarding the pattern of creation include 1, cosmic temporal inauguration. Walton argues that Genesis 1 should be understood as an account of the inauguration of the cosmos as a temple rather than a material creation narrative. I wouldn't place one over the other. That's dangerous. I think both are valid. I like the second. I like this new one better. And 2, functional ontology. He posits the ancient Near East cultures, including Israel, were more concerned with the functions, purposes, things. Well, that's right in the book. Yeah, Matthieu states that right up front. Like the ancient people, he doesn't limit it to a region, right? He says the ancient people, and I think he's right about this. I would argue that was true in the medieval period as well, right? People were far more concerned with meaning than they were with some carved up, precise, accurate, consistent, reliable description, which is a scientific way of thinking about things. I think that's kind of abundantly clear. All right, what else we got? What happened to Danny?
Well, I think a big question that came up last time that you didn't really elaborate too much on, and maybe it was difficult to talk about, but something that came up for me that I was thinking about is how you, in the first chapters of the book, so before chapter 11 or something, Matthieu sets up this, let me call it a binary or a polarity. I'm really trying to avoid the word opposition here, of heaven and earth. And it's very extreme. So you have the heaven up top and the earth down below.
Yep.
But in these chapters, he says, well, he expands on it and he shows that it's more of a gradual descent or ascent, whichever. Yeah, that probably matters. I haven't thought about that one, but I think it'll be fruitful if we talk a little bit about the symmetries and the asymmetries of this polarity, because so one thing that really came up is that if you look at that same, well, not triangle diagram, but the one with the symbol in the middle and the principle up top, is that God is the principle which is at the very top, which doesn't need something above it. So the highest abstract spirit principle is, the ineffable, the self-sufficient, and all that sort of stuff. So it's the thing that doesn't need anything above it. But so
Sure.
what about the other pole? What about the bottom? Where the atoms or something are. Like, what is, as we go down the levels, as we go down the categories and down the hierarchy, what does it look like? What does the Earth pole look like? Is it sort of infinite? Does it go infinitely down? Or at some point do we sort of hit bedrock? Is my question. Does that make sense at all to anyone?
think I see what you're getting at there. I don't see that in there. I think though what I do want to say is what you said is mostly correct, but there is the asymmetry, right? There's one at the top and two at the bottom. There's an asymmetry, right? That is a universal asymmetry in that if you rotate it, the asymmetry, you can't make the asymmetry go away by rotation, right? It doesn't matter what axis you process that on, it's not going away. Doesn't work in 3 dimensions. Yeah, it's a book, it's a print, like whatever. Right, but the principle's intact because that principle exists in 3 dimensions as well. We know this mathematically. Not a math guy, so I'm just telling you that's true. Other people have told me it's true. They're smart math guys. I'm not. Can't do math. Division is too hard. Multiplication is also it's too difficult for me. So if you think about it mathematically in terms of symmetry and asymmetry, the asymmetry is universal. Another way to look at it is to say, oh, look, the top comes down and spreads out. Right. But his point is, like, there's 3 things, top and 2 things at the bottom, right? But his point is now there's a middle thing called a symbol in that particular diagram that you're referencing, right? And so he's introduced a 4th player on the board or component or thing to talk about, and that is this transition in the sequence of the chapters. That's what this transition is. Does that make more sense?
Yeah. Well, I guess if you want to be really idolatrous, then you could put the symbol at the top, and then you could submit the principle and the examples to it.
The principle, I see what you're saying. I don't think that's entirely incorrect. I would say never do that. Like unless you really know what you're doing. But yeah. But again, it is a universal, right? It does not matter which way you turn it at some point, right? Because the relationship is important. The problem is you don't understand the world unless it's turned correctly. So this gets into the idea, on navigating patterns, right? Like orientation matters, not just direction. So you can't say, well, there's 2 and then there's 1 and it doesn't matter which way they flow. It actually does, right? Because spirit precedes material according to Matthieu and the material he's referencing. So it does matter, right? But in terms of the asymmetry, it doesn't matter. And there's usefulness in turning it around, just as long as you don't try to understand the whole world that way. Like this is the scientific argument, right? The scientific argument is roughly, if you change your perspective, you can do cool things like build a plane. That's true, right? But if your purpose of flying a plane is to crash it into 2 towers and kill a lot of people, then I would argue you shouldn't build the plane. And I understand the ridiculousness of that argument, believe me. But also, it's not wrong. And that's what's really important, right? So you can imagine a scenario where we built a device that is just capable of, no, it's worse. I'm sorry. Let me back that up. You can imagine a scenario where we created an entire set of technologies to be able to build multiple devices, which could, in some sense, create, we'll say, ridiculously hot fires or an invisible force that rips apart DNA en masse, right? And because we did that we then built the stupid things, and then you created a situation called mutually assured destruction. Now, you could posit that as a theoretical thing, or you could realize we did that, right? And then there are lots of arguments, right, about whether or not we should have done that. That's right. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. And then that argument always goes back to the sort of flattened view of, well, somebody would have done it. It's like, that's not actually clear. It's certainly theoretically possible that somebody would have done it, but that's not clear at all. It's not even clear that just anybody can do that. Thank goodness, and because we have lots of people trying who can't do it for various reasons. So yeah, it might just be too technically difficult, right? It might require too many resources outside of your own country. There's lots of reasons why it might be very hard. And so I would argue, yeah, it does matter how you look at these things, because otherwise you might create a weapon of mutually assured destruction. That's, I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just saying when you don't pay attention to that, you run into these problems. So yeah, don't flip that over. Just submit to Matthieu's little system. It's cool. How's that?
Yeah. And also the telos matters. So
right. Exactly. Well said.
Just before we move on to the later chapters, because I think that's kind of what Gustav was getting into, I wanted to bring up something in chapter 8 one more time. So I think Mark may be able to help me with this. So to understand the abstract principle and then the concrete principles, I kind of mapped it to object-oriented programming. I did have a bit of an issue trying to figure out what the symbol of that would be. So the abstract principle would, for example, be a class definition, and then concrete examples would be on instantiated objects, and then the symbol would be the meaning that's derived by that setup within like the system or for the user of or whoever. Like what would be the symbol? Like,
that's a really good question. I hadn't thought of mapping it that way because I was like, well, the class is called an abstraction, of course. Of course,
yeah,
it's called an abstraction. It's no magic. They named it properly. Why isn't this how nobody links programming to this stuff? I'm like, oh my goodness, it's all laid out really well. Actually, programmers are really precise. Actually, it's the best way to think of these things. I always thought Latin should be a programming language because it's such a good language. It's so verbose and precise. It's like you never should code in Latin. That's what you should do. Yeah, and OO sort of represents that first jump out of the concrete programming, programming to function, which is that's functional programming. Programming to function or programming based on procedures, right? Sort of gets broken by or enhanced by is a better way to say it. The object oriented. So in that scenario, I actually think I just want to look at the diagrams again real quick. The abstract principle, this probably isn't clear. The abstract principle and the symbol in that instance are the same thing. And so the abstract principle contains the purpose, the class, sorry. Let me do this correctly. Apologies. The class contains the abstraction, and that abstraction contains the purpose of the class or the telos of the class, right? And it also includes all the objects, right, or that are in there, right? And then the instantiation of that object is now a symbol that represents a specific instance of the abstraction. That's actually the way it works in OO. I think I got all that right.
Wait, so what's the concrete?
The instantiation is to concrete, but again, the instantiation contains more than one thing, and therefore it is an abstraction. Like that's actually the problem, right? Because again, well, you have to contrast it with other programming languages. Like in BASIC, I mean, you make the argument you could do it in BASIC, but I don't want to get into how much knowledge I have about how to manipulate programming languages. It's not helpful, right? In BASIC, you can't do it effectively, right? You can't abstract things out in that way. You can only abstract things out to orders of abstraction through variables, right? And variable reference. Or actually in BASIC, you might only be able to do one layer of abstraction. It depends how you count abstraction programming, but you have to refer to the object directly through a variable. So there's one layer of abstraction in the variable, right? You're not referring to just an object with a class, right? You're referring to a bunch of variables and a bunch of objects in a class. And so it's already an abstraction. All classes are abstractions. All instantiations of classes are abstractions because they contain multiple instances, or I would call them manifestations in this context, but they contain multiple manifestations of a thing. And so the grouping is arbitrary. So the group is always an abstraction, is basically what I'm trying to say. Does that map?
Kind of, yeah. Yeah, but we should move on, not to bore anybody else.
Yeah, no, you have to think of it in terms of how would this be done in functional programming language versus how is it done in OO. And I think that differentiation will come out pretty quick.
Yeah, let me just. I'm sorry, I'm really struggling to track the conversation because my internet, but it seems to be okay. So I'm gonna go really fast right now. So forgive me. The most basic unit of indirection in computer science is an interface. An abstract class is just a class that can't be implemented. But the most basic design patterns are things like the strategy pattern, which is I have one strategy to just find an abstract, and I have many implementations behind that. We can talk about it from a bunch of different angles. We can take this offline, but we can flush this out in detail. This is my area of expertise. But what I like about how he does in Plato, for example, when Plato just uses dialectic, he uses lots of different lenses to define things, and I think that's one of the important things to take away when it comes to category. And whether you're talking about something like justice in the utility lens, almost every concept that you can define, you can use different lenses that will blur the line, that challenge the meaning of what you're talking about. And the cherub in maps of meaning here is a hybrid category. And hybrid categories exist to show the limits of things. And so that he didn't explicitly say that in the book, but the concept of hybridity and limitation is at the core of the fundamental concepts of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. And I like the way that he says the understanding is the power that supports a principle with specific facts. I think building a house on fact is not a stable foundation because facts can be knocked out. And the way that he defines knowledge is that it's the process and the final result of the interaction between the wisdom and understanding. So I think that's a really fundamental concept that I think a lot of people just don't really understand. And I think if you extend the concepts of knowledge and understanding and wisdom and things like that, and get to more fundamental concepts of like memory and attention, I think this is kind of at the root of a lot of disagreements that we have over lots of basic concepts and categories.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think, though, that one way to think about lenses, whenever anybody talks about lenses, and this won't be 100% right, but like I'm a pragmatist, I'll take 90% right. And it's probably 90% right. Just say perspective. That's basically all it is. And then the world will make more sense. And the problem with facts is that facts are dependent upon perspective, right? Because the way you interface with a fact has to do with how you come at it. And some facts aren't relevant. So, for example, all right, I'll just screw that. I did it last night. I'll do it again. If somebody's senile and in a senior position and you don't acknowledge that, the fact is not relevant to you because it doesn't change how you feel about the person or how you feel about what they're leading or how you're going to vote or which party you support. Okay, so the fact that was clear for years didn't impact you, right? And that's because of your perspective, right? And maybe your perspective is stuck in that case, but also unsticking that part of your perspective and not the rest is a big problem. In other words, seems like you got better, but actually you didn't get any better. And that's sort of, that's what happens when you get a stuck perspective on something, right? Like if you can't see that religion is everywhere and you're just going to adopt or not adopt one, not adopt a specific one, but adopt a specific other one, then you're not going to understand the world, right? Because you're not going to be able to engage with what's actually going on around you in a helpful way, right? And that wipes people out all the time, right? Given perspective stuff. So
is dark his category for objective material reality?
Is what?
Is dark his category for objective OMR, objective material reality?
No, I don't think he has an objective material reality category. Because that's a scientific thing. He's not talking about a scientific engagement, right? He's talking about not that, right? He's trying to highlight not that. That would be my argument. And I don't think that exists outside of science at all. Like I think OMR is a side effect of science explicitly. I did want to highlight
Yeah,
live,
maybe it's
or
something
die.
like
Are you sure?
just yeah.
I wonder what you're referring to, because I go off sometimes and I'm not able to read the chat while I'm doing complex mappings for things that I never have found a need to map before. My bad. But also, like, I don't know. I don't know what you guys don't see. I have no idea. Sorry, Gustas. Go ahead.
I was thinking about how like OMR might be a sort of looking downwards instead of upwards, which you've talked about before. Is that you're trying to
Yeah.
explore the space that's below you in the hierarchy, the materiality, looking at things that are smaller and smaller and never quite, and looking for the answer there instead of looking up and engaging with things higher and assembling and maybe I don't know.
OMR, right? Objective materiality is the assumption that you are outside of the world, and that therefore you can see it in a clear way that is correct without a standard. Like, they don't tell you that part. Like, yeah, but you don't have a standard. Even if you could do that, which you can't, you don't have a standard. And oh, by the way, um, if you understand the general theory of relativity, it wouldn't be useful if you could do that. And that's where people get really wrapped around the axle. But actually, if you read the book, and if you understand the theory, it wouldn't be useful to do that, right? Yeah, so I think I like what Danny said before everyone's having connection problems today. The hybridity and the hitting the boundaries, basically. I'd have to think more about how explicit that is. I don't think it's explicit in chapter 9, but I might be able to agree in the book that hybridity as the thing that highlights constraint or boundaries or something is in the book. I can definitely potentially buy into that, but I think that the important part is that, I kind of went over this earlier. Having the pattern, right? Having the structure isn't enough. It has to be oriented correctly too, right? Because you can orient this stuff in a way that no longer maps to reality correctly, we'll say. We can argue about correctly, but like, I don't. He's got a standard for correctness. I'll just leave it at that. Anybody want to say anything else about 9, or? Because to me, it's just the instantiation of
maybe.
8, right? Specificate. It's a specific example of what he goes over in 8. But what do you got, Gustas?
Well, I have this idea that I've been thinking about, and it's kind of linking into this, is about that there's a sort of reality to certain resolutions of the world for us to engage with it. Is that there is a certain reality to the resolution of an individual or of one person, and then the next level up would be a family, and the level up from that would be a tribe or a church or something. But this idea about resolutions, I think, makes more sense when you think about so like chemistry. So you have the atom,
right.
you have the molecule, and you have
Right.
the whatever the thing above that, and then you have the cells and the organs, and so we can think of a cell, and we can think of a
So
tissue.
let me stop you right there real quick. Just real quick. So when you say resolution, I'm not going after your language at all. But when you say resolution, it sounds to me like you're referring to layer of analysis, which I would agree is actually the same thing. But I want to use that. I want to introduce that. I'm not saying change your language. I'm saying I want to introduce that conceptually. Like resolution and layer of analysis are related, right? This is the telescope microscope thing we were talking about last time, right? Like there's different resolutions to those things, right? You resolve things through focus, right? And what you're doing is when you're changing the focus on those things is you're actually changing which layer you're looking at of reality. So that seems to be what you're saying. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I just want to make that
I
more
think
clear.
yes, yeah. Well, kind of like that. But my point is more that the layer of analysis or the resolution of a cell is useful because we can look at a cell and we can analyze it and we kind of see what it does.
Yeah.
We can look at a tissue and we can see what it does and it works in a certain way and we can make formulas for it and all that. But what is in between a tissue and a cell? There's like a stepping up from that, and it just doesn't make sense to us. Like what half a tissue is
Right.
it just doesn't do that same thing, and it's somehow similar with so you can simulate water molecules, and then you can simulate like droplets, and you can simulate streams, but like in between it gets so complicated that you need supercomputers, and it just doesn't make sense to anyone. It doesn't make sense. Like
Right.
in between, I don't know. Yeah. I
Well,
hope
but
that idea makes sense.
yeah. Well, let me just flesh it out real quick. So what that means is all layers of analysis are not valid, right? And you can't just slam things together and name them and have a thing, right? Yes, I agree. Which means you need an authority to help with that. And yeah, Father Eric,
I'm sure
the
you need
problem
an
of
authority.
ambiguity, right? The problem of ambiguity, things that do not have an intrinsic unity, right? There are things that do not have an intrinsic unity. Everything is not equal, and therefore, right? And I think that's what the hybrid example is, right? Because he's got eagle on the top, bull on the bottom, lion on the bottom, and in the middle is human, right? In the same in the exact same sort of pattern as before. And I think that's I mean, I think that's super important actually. Is we're still following that pattern. This is just an explicit instantiation of the pattern.
So I think my idea was more about how the hybrid is an example of an invalid layer of analysis. Like it's just something that doesn't really make sense. Would that track,
And
or is that like just a bad
you're
idea?
agreeing with Danny. I mean, he doesn't make that point in 9. Maybe he makes the point later. Or maybe in 10, actually. So, well, let's move to 10, the light and the darkness, the spiritual perspective on light and darkness. You got any notes for that, Gustavs, or
Really? Sorry.
anyone? Thoughts on 10 on light and darkness spiritual perspective? This is actually oddly, we talked about this last night on my stream on Navigating Patterns. The blade and the inclined plane, the stairway and the wedge and the ramp.
Okay, so you're talking about chapter 10, right?
Yeah.
That one was a bit challenging for me, and I think I can sum it up in the fact that, so he says that the spiritual principle is an invisible source of light that implicitly contains an answer. And then he also asserts that this spiritual principle is pure meaning. If it implicitly contains that answer, then I don't understand how it's pure meaning. I think this goes back to the very first thing we talked about, where the way I'm seeing it is that the meaning is contained within the symbol, and that's the union of both of those. And so pure meaning within the spiritual is confusing to me.
Yeah, I can see why that's confusing, right? Because in that instance, it sounds to me like you're treating the symbol as a manifestation, but it's the thing that meets manifestation from potential, right? So you've got potential on the top, manifestation on the bottom. The symbol binds them and allows you access to both. Otherwise, you're stuck with one or the other. Does that help?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I like being able to play with the language a little bit because we've got the problem is we have a bunch of very overlapping words for these things, and some of them I would argue are more secular. I make this argument navigating patterns about how Peterson talks versus how Pageau talks, for example, Jonathan Pageau or Matthieu, and that for that matter, but Jonathan in particular, he just has more stuff, right? The way he talks about the same things that Peterson talks about, he just uses different language. Concepts are all the same, right? I mean, this is my argument for there's no need to bind East and West. They're saying the same thing, like really, like, honestly, exactly the same thing. There's no difference. There's a difference in how it's structurally approached in a language because Easterners and Westerners think differently. See the Geography of Thought, great book. But it was interesting because John mentioned this last night. He said, well, there's blade and stairway, and you don't want to, if I think of blade and stairway, I get afraid. But when you put in the inclined plane, it actually makes sense. And I was like, wow, that's really insightful, John. I don't know how that came up in my live stream last night, but okay. And I hadn't even reread. I mean, I've read this before, but I hadn't reread the chapter yet. So I was like, oh, now I see more clearly what he was talking about. Because the diagram, the inclined plane's on the top. So it sort of comes down. And I like, he says, light would be needed to clarify the matter, right? Because light is clarifying. That's one of the end of one of the sentences in here. But we rarely think about the flip side of the cognitive process. The idea can also be too abstract to grasp and may require detailed examples to appreciate its ramifications. The irony of this is that's chapter 8 and chapter 9. Chapter 8 is purely the abstract, and chapter 9 is the implementation or the manifestation of chapter 8, right? Where he talks about the eagle, the bull, the lion, and the human in the middle.
Yeah, I think my problem is just with the word purity used for both the spiritual and the material.
That, to me, sounds
whether
very
purity...
Protestant, just off the top of my head. But hey, what do I know? Shall we move to chapter 11? If anybody wants details on that, hop on my Discord server and I will rant at you angrily for as long as you wish. Chapter 11, spiritual material dimensions. You have any notes for this, Gustavs, for 11?
Yeah. So something that really I'm trying to get at more of the practical ways these things manifest, seeing them in life, just not just sitting and staring at my screen, right? And the one that really does make sense to me. So looking at this as a graduated hierarchy instead of a sort of pure heaven, earth, abstract talking, is the air, water, earth, and the light at the top. And well, first of all, light I think is kind of synonymous with fire, in this respect. But unless it's useful to us, then I don't know why I even mentioned that. But I'm thinking about the way these things apply and how, for example, the elements that are higher in the hierarchy sort of unify those that are lower and form into a thing. And one thing that keeps coming up to me is how water and earth interact, how they have this heaven and earth relationship, and water come together to unify earth. So if you take dry sand or dry mud or something, which is like dust basically, and you add water to it, it unifies and it forms into it changes the level of analysis, it changes the resolution. And the same happens, which I think is very significant, when you bake bread. You have flour, which is just like ununified, and the level of analysis is also like it's dust. It's this unformed mass. When you add the water to it, then you form it into a loaf, and that's a completely different.
Unity.
Like,
Yeah.
It's a unity. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think that's significant, but I don't really understand how air can unify water or things like that. I think that's a bit, I don't know.
That's a cloud, air and water, and it's linked to get like how are
Yeah,
clouds formed? Particles. It's all right there. I don't know why you guys don't see it. It's all right there.
I know, but it's
Well,
just,
well, and let me posit something here. I'm not going to make a claim. I'm not. This is like a new occurrence for me in my thinking on this. I only did partially one book club with BOM on this book, so maybe it's helpful to think about, we'll say, the outline of this, three things creates a fourth thing and this triangular relationship. And then to think of this outline of the mixing in parallel. So they're not the same thing, right? But they are different ways of representing things. So you could represent the same thing on the mixing chart with light at the top, air, water, and earth. And you could represent anything that same way with the triangle chart, right? With one thing at the one unifying principle at the top, and then two things at the bottom, and the symbolic representation in the middle. That might be a useful way to think about it. I don't know if that's how valid that is, but I just want to throw that out there because it just occurred to me that might be helpful.
Gustav, when you were talking about the mixing of earth and water, is that another microcosm of the heaven and earth unity? Is that how you meant it, or did I misunderstand that?
exactly. That is the point that I wanted to make, is that the water comes down and it sort of informs the earth, the dust, and then the dust sort of actually forms because if you make a what do you call, like a mud pie, like a bunch of mud, all of the mass, all of the materiality of it is the mud. Anyway, the mud particles, the earth. You're only adding a little bit of water to it, so it's like the major part of it in terms of quantity, in terms of material, is still the dust. But the water comes in and completely changes the identity of the thing and makes it into a loaf of bread or of sticky earth that holds together into a unit. Because otherwise it doesn't hold. At best it's like a pile of dust, of
so
sand.
the
Yeah,
water
that's
informs
exactly the point.
the flour. The water informs the
When you bake
flour
bread, yeah.
into a dough, and then you add the fire in and you inform the dough into bread.
And it has air inside it. So
Mm-hmm.
It's all unified in bread. Bread is the ultimate unity, and gives life. There you go. Problem solved. All symbolism has been resolved. No need for the further book club. Are we good? Are we good on chapter 11 or? Anyone? Oh, Father Eric is accusing us of becoming a cooking show. Too bad. Oh, but actually, yes, bread is the ultimate unity of mankind. Or man king? I think that's probably mankind. Yes, Father. Whatever Father says, I agree with.
yeah, but bread, once it's like what like when you make it, it breaks apart eventually, and then like you still have the liquid principle coming in and unifying all of mankind as well. So yeah, I think
What do you mean
I
the
think that's
liquid
important.
principle?
It's so for example, in our body, just person, right? I have a body. All my organs communicate through my blood in a way. Like if yeah, it's like the blood is the one organ that is inside all of my other organs. So it's the unifying principle. Like it's the liquid, and the rest of me is kind of solid. I think that's kind of close to the idea. I haven't quite learned to talk about it very well, but I have the idea inside here.
I like that. Anything else for 11? I mean, everyone's fine with matter being connected to darkness, and which is correct, or yes, true. We go on to 12, the dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Someone's got to have notes on this. Come on. This is an interesting chapter. No, because this is a
I
weird
think
thing.
what I found notable about it is how actually the metals get denser as they go up, which seems like this weird inconsistency somehow. Like I'm sure it has meaning. And I'm sure that Matthieu knows it has meaning, but I don't know what to do with that. So
It's a flip.
Just pointing it out.
No, the whole thing's a flip. The whole thing's flipped.
Mm.
Right. So yeah, to your point, right? The change in the change in everything, right? And the fact that he's linking a dream to an instantiation of the previous pattern, right? So the light, air, water, earth, he links that to a dream. That's right, with the backwards material relationship, or a flipped material relationship, to your point. Yeah, fascinating. But 12 really is just the manifestation or instantiation of 11. Like that's It's interesting that he's added another layer, right? Kind of sneaking it in there. I would call that. Not that I disagree. I'm just pointing out, but it's adding complexity effectively. He's adding free variables to the equation effectively, right? When he does this, because now it's a dream.
I think
it's a dream. It's a dream about a symbol, and the symbol matches. The symbol is the instantiation of the previous pattern of light, air, water, earth, right? So, and you're right. He links light to fire, which is actually kind of important. And then that makes the gold more easily understood, right? Because gold is the closest color really to fire in some sense, at least in the fire, the kind of fire they had.
Mark, can you explain?
Yeah, well,
the
in Hebrew,
significance of-
fire and light are the same word.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Sorry, go.
I was just going to ask Mark to explain the significance of the concept that it's a dream.
So previously, right, when he did this, right, he's pointing out there's a principle, and here's how you apply the principle. And the application is purely material or physical. In this case, he's saying there's a dream, and it's a dream about something that can't, like, no one's, to the best of my knowledge, no one's built a gold, silver, brass, iron, clay statue as outlined by the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. But he does illustrate the pattern. But it doesn't just illustrate the pattern of light, air, water, earth. No, it also illustrates the pattern of the connection between a symbol in a dream to the pattern of light, air, water, earth, right? So it's more explicitly symbolic. In other words, he's used effectively two layers of abstraction to explain something in a concrete manner, which is a really strange thing to do ultimately, but also, like, 100% agree. Like, it's a clever trick. I don't know how well it works. But it's an interesting way to do it. because I would never have gone to dream ever. But it's not my game is secularism. My game's not biblicalism or religionism. However you want to think of this. I'm not trying to understand language creation when I talk. So I wouldn't use a dream example, unless it was specific. Does that make sense, Alana? Do you like? There's a lot more going on, like if I say, right. So if you sort of go back and you look at inclined plane, blade, stairway, like I know what all those things are. Like, sure. A statue made of gold, silver, brass, iron, and clay. Like, I don't. What are you talking about? Right? Because it's a dream, and you can do that in a dream, and it's not a problem. But it does exemplify light, air, water, earth perfectly, right? But it's also not instantiated. Like, I can't go there and touch the thing. There aren't those things. But I know where a stairway is, and an inclined wedge, and a blade. Like, sure. I probably have all those things like right around me. I have 0 statues of gold, silver, brass, iron, and clay anywhere near me that I know of. I'm not sure there are any. So, see what I'm saying? It's just an additional abstraction because I can't touch it.
Okay.
It's a different way of understanding. And I mean, he's explicit about that in the book. Like, I'm going to give you a different way of understanding by reading this book and looking at silly pictures. Okay. And I think he does. Like, I don't want to say it worked for me because I was kind of like, oh yeah, this is an interesting way to think about all of this stuff that's clearly correct. It didn't really cause a lot of enlightenment in my head, unfortunately. But it's great. Like, I love the way he's laid it out. Obviously, I could not lay it out that way because I never read this silly book he's talking about. So, creation, yes. Book, no. I don't. That's my problem. Everybody else doesn't have that problem. All right. Are we good with that? I mean, are we fine with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and we'll say the mapping of 12 onto 11? And
Gustav was saying something about the Hebrew word for light or fire.
Same word, yeah.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, just it's the same word.
Did you go over that with Manuel on agapic orientation? Is that one of the words you guys covered?
As a matter of fact, it was, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, if people want more, they can go to Agapic Orientation, Manuel's wonderful channel, and check out, a longer discussion between you two. You have 2 videos about language and in that way, right?
That's right. We went through a bunch of old Aramaic language and picked up on different connections between words that are the same word or very, very closely related in the Aramaic, but in English or in whatever other European language we have, it's sort of very different words, and maybe in the Bible it's different words, but in the Aramaic it links different concepts really closely together. Which kind of bridges and associates and things like that. Yeah. So fire and light being the same word is one of those examples.
Excellent. Yeah. I just there's a discussion about this if you want to see it and don't want to just engage with the book club because we do so much more. Ethan, gold has less practical use as opposed to iron, but is more valuable. It's more valuable because it has less practical use. I had a discussion with Nick about this. We were both like, oh, wait a minute. We're using gold now. That's not good. Computer's evil. Roughly. Ethan, each have a different kind of potential. Yes, that is correct. Sandro, good to see you, sir. I hope you are well. Is it a coincidence, the parallels to Plato's Republic? A lot of hay has been made about this, from what I can tell. And the philosophy types who I dislike insist that, well, of course, Judaism was known to the ancient Greeks. Probably, but who cares? My argument is going to be, because I'm living proof that, if you just investigate this, you're going to come to the same answer. I don't know why that would be a controversial thing to say, but people are very upset about it. So yeah, I wouldn't I wouldn't worry too much about it. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think either they're coming from the same source or they're coming from the same source. And if the path is one source read the other source, they're still coming from the same source. And if the path is we independently discovered the source, who cares? The result is the same. Pragmatism for the win. Thank you very much. That's my TED Talk. Chapter 13. Unless Danny's got something to chime in on 11 and 12 here. I think you missed both of them.
No, I got nothing.
Okay. Oh, well, just before I continue, thank you, Ethan. Ethan insists that truth needs no conspiracy. That's correct. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. All right, Sanjuro. Yeah, maybe just the language of symbolism. Shout out to pragmatism. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Let's do 13. This is the example, wisdom and understanding. I figured we'd probably get stuck here for a while, so let's. What you got, guys? Everyone understood it perfectly. No questions, no notes. Is that what you're telling me?
My biggest takeaway, I guess, from that chapter, or biggest question from that chapter is the idea that wisdom was presented as a purely heavenly or spiritual principle, but in a lot of the rest of the Bible, it's always depicted as feminine, as Sophia, or in Proverbs, is used as she. So I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts about that.
I have way too many thoughts about that are way too disorganized. But let's let everybody else go first, and then maybe by that time I can actually put them into words. But also oddly mentioned on my live stream last night. Just saying. I don't know why this came up. I didn't read ahead. I read minutes before the book club begins. So just in case you're confused. Gustavs, nothing. Christopher, nothing. Really?
Well, okay. So I think that I think that the language of wisdom and understanding and knowledge and the fool and all of these sorts of things is really important, and I'm not convinced that I understand it, and I'm not convinced that the answer is immediately available to me, because everything I've read about it hasn't been convincing at all. And I think that, well, and kind of jumping topics, because I would like to say something about wisdom, is that, so these might just be my musings, my half digested thoughts, but I kind of think that wisdom is in a way like the category of categories, because it's like you can put things into it, like when something makes sense, like a pattern, it is sort of subsumed by it, and it's bigger than anything. Like you can't really define it, because then it kind of just grows bigger. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my thought. And I think wisdom is really important. Yeah.
Yeah. And just before we get Mark's thoughts, another thing I want to add about that seemed relevant is in Proverbs, there's a passage that talks about wisdom being there sort of as a partner almost to God when he establishes the heavens and the earth. And so in that context, it makes sense for it to be the feminine. So I don't understand the concept of it as a seed and as a masculine.
Well, in Christianity, and I think in Judaism as well, the first thing that was ever created was the tabernacle, or like the pattern of the tabernacle in heaven, and that kind of equates it with wisdom, with Sophia. Yeah, and I think the Psalms also speak on this, although I can't give you a quote. Sorry.
Let me just read this real quick. Ray, sorry you're not here, Ray. The sequence of chapters is important if I could point it out. I will riff on that first. I said earlier he's pointing out the abstractions and then the instantiations. That's backwards from how everybody does it in the age of gnosis. The scientific way of doing it is pointing out the thing and then pointing the abstractions. Generally, not universally, generally, right? And he's doing it backwards to Ray's point on purpose. And it's super important. Not that you should pay attention to that. You should just know that that's how it's happening. Sanjuro. Well, thank you for that, Sanjuro. Middle out. I would say it's related to middle out. It's also related to a bigger problem that I've identified called nobody knows what sequence is anymore, and therefore they can't see contradiction and paradox correctly. But longer topic for another day. I think, Elena, I wanna cut it this way. I want to say, if you're talking about the feminine or an instantiation of a female, right? So I'm not. I want to make a distinction between the archetypal female or the archetypal divine feminine, because that's an archetype, right? And an instantiation. So Sophia as a person that represents wisdom. Okay. So when you're talking about a person, you're not talking about something up in heaven anymore, because there's no persons in heaven.
Yeah,
Does that help?
I don't know that feminine and masculine may be the best terms to use here. Just, I guess, and then material principle doesn't really feel right either. But it is, in this chapter, it's identified as a spiritual principle. And
right.
The feminine is traditionally not identified with that. And so, but the pronoun
traditionally, which tradition? You're gonna have to really dig down on that for me, because I'm on the other side of that. I mean, if I wanted to get cute and cheeky and really imprecise just to make a joke, I'd say women are wicked smart in that way, that men are not, right? Like women contain more wisdom on average than men. Men are basically retarded, and that's our job. So it's fine. That's I mentioned that on my live stream last night too, weirdly. I don't know what the hell's going on with the universe today. Yeah, I mean, women are wise. Like they right, men will just charge in and like blow stuff up because it's fun. And women will be like, maybe when you're blowing stuff up, you should stand back a little bit further. Right? It's because that's wisdom. And men are retarded. We'll just, I want to stand next to the explosive so I can see it better. Like I cut my hand. How do you think I did that? Because I wasn't paying attention at all. I was like, I'm gonna fix this damn saw no matter. There was blood everywhere. It was no good. Had a woman been there to say maybe you shouldn't put your hand there, well, you know, the wisdom might have soaked in, and I don't know. I'm just saying.
So where does the concept in this chapter come that it is a spiritual principle, or am I restricting the categories too much?
I mean, it's on top.
Well, he says it's an axiom. He says wisdom is like an axiom. Is just like an axiom. It's like potential that exists or something. It's just
So yeah, right in the beginning, I'll just read it. Right in the Bible, the union of heaven and earth is often defined in terms of wisdom and understanding. Right, but then he says these are the divine principles by which God, quote, founded the earth and, quote, established the heavens. And so it just maps. It's not the same thing, but it maps. Does that help, or did I make you more confused?
I don't know. He's on page 45, he explains understanding as establishing the heavens, which would be earth, and then wisdom is founding the earth, which would be heaven, in my understanding.
From memory, I believe that he said that wisdom was like the spiritual identity that stretched out. I think at the bottom he had understanding, knowledge is in the middle, and wisdom was the spiritual identity that stretched out or covered them. And so it's like to me that jives with the popular notions of feminine, you know, the space or potential that exists. in order for things to manifest from.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Well, and he
also
links it to the
probably
seed, right? He links it to the seed, which is the potential.
well. Also, there's the he has wisdom above, understanding below, but there's also the two nodes below there, and he just mentions understanding. So there's maybe something implicit that you're supposed to think about there as well. That isn't explicitly stated with understanding.
I mean, the thing about wisdom is that, which I think I've heard Matthieu Pageau talk about this in interviews and such, is that a lot of the cosmic categories in popular wisdoms are very simple. A lot of the time that, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Like you could call that a wisdom. Very simple, right? Yet it contains a lot of different ways it can manifest, and it could be fleshed out in very profound ways. So like when Matthieu Pageau is asked about a lot of these like axioms, a lot of them are very simple, like A equals A, like A equals itself. A lot of the observations are maybe even so simple that we don't see them or don't recognize them, and maybe that's part of the value of putting on the different lenses is, hey, when you acknowledge that time maybe doesn't mean what we think it means, or space doesn't mean what we think it means, it takes us to very different places.
Yeah, well, it's not. Yeah, I wouldn't put it in meaning. I would put it in relationship. If we relate to time in the way that we have been, we'll say in the age of gnosis, some people might call that the modern era, or it would be an error, by the way, not an era. I don't like that word for various reasons. See, navigating patterns. How we relate to space and time is the thing that actually is important. And if our relationship to space and time breaks down, you might move from the age of gnosis to the age of reckoning. See my live stream last night. That was my thesis. Hope I'm wrong. Don't think so though. The idea of the seed, because he goes over it, in here with Proverbs, right? The seed can't manifest whatever it's supposed to manifest without the earth. It has to be buried in the earth to actually. This is actually a complaint I have. A lot of people will play a trick on you and other people, and they'll say something really completely fantastically incorrect and say, the seed contains everything it needs to grow into a tree, and that is so false. Why are you lying? Right? No, you need the earth, you need the sunlight, you need the water, you need the temperature. Like there's so many things outside the seed. And we know this because if you just have a seed, it doesn't just turn into whatever it's supposed to turn into. You actually have to go put it in the ground and hopefully cultivate it. And it has to be cultivated. Maybe nature will magically cultivate it by itself, although one seed, the odds that nature is going to cultivate it are very low, right? And the more you cultivate, the more efficient it is. Like that seems to be a fair way to sort of think about it. And so the seed alone won't do that. So it needs something else, right? And the union of the seed with the things that aren't in the seed, or in this case, the earthly things, is what manifests the tree. And does that help a little bit? Because again, that's the wisdom, according to the chapter here.
A bit. I think the way that I'm trying to resolve it is by thinking of it as an entity having different valence of like spiritual versus more material, depending on the context that it's in. I don't know if that makes sense, but like wisdom here is depicted as Sophia, as a spiritual principle, as a seed, which usually is equated to heaven. And then, but also like Danny said, it contains potential, which is more so of a earth idea, and then the fact that it's often depicted as Sophia also is more earthly. So the way I'm trying to resolve that is by just saying that it depends on the contextualization and like its relation to everything else around it. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, potential is all heaven for me. It's all upstairs. Actual is earth. I didn't. So I don't know where you.
Well, I don't
The
know
thing
exactly
that-
what we're trying to clarify, but he in future chapters he uses examples of like manna being spiritual food, as the, man does not live by bread alone type of ideas. I mean, I
Right.
don't know whether it's productive to call that feminine or not. I mean, personally, I'm not a huge fan of those lenses. I mean, some people like them, but he does give some concrete examples like such as manna as being spiritual subsistence. And so if you think about what that does, it's like there's the flesh. The flesh has certain needs and it has certain types of necessities. This is sort of a hint at Plato if you're kind of familiar with how Plato makes arguments about necessity of different things. But there are other types of necessity and other ways that we need to be nurtured that are non-material, that people use different language for.
Yeah, and I would say that all wisdom is abstract, like all of it. In fact, I would say, I'm not going to stand on this. I'm going to state it tentatively that all wisdom is a second order abstraction. If Manuel were here, I'd feel more comfortable because he'd just yell at me if I was wrong, but he's not here. So I'm going to state that and say I might not be a second order abstraction, but it's definitely abstract, right? Again, back to the example, right? The student will show up when the teacher is ready, sort of thing. It's like, that's very abstract. Lots of different implementations. I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with things like middle out thinking. I see navigating patterns. I got all this up there. OMR, right? Objective material reality. What happens is we look down because we just happen to be standing on the earth pretty much, right? And we look down and we go, oh, things come out of the earth, right? So I was straightening out the bottom of the pole shed today and found 3 more trees, that were buried, had been trees. We cut them down, but like they're under my pole shed. They got to go. I got to put a floor in there, right? And like that, it emerged from the ground as I'm trying to make it smooth. And I'm like, what the hell is this? Like, where did this come from? It emerged from the ground, and obviously it grew from a seed at some point, and it was cultivated by the earth because I didn't want it there, so I didn't plant these things and like try to make them grow under my pole shed, which is dumb. They shouldn't have been there. Pole shed provides too much shade. So for me, it emerged. But what actually happened is it grew. If I use my perspective, it emerged. And I can go, ooh, trees emerge from the ground. Emergence is good. And okay, that's not what happened. The seed fell from somewhere and got into the ground. It fell from above, actually, for sure. Or it was brought from above, and an animal put it on the ground in that place, right? However, maybe not deliberately, maybe deliberately. Sometimes animals bury seeds, right? And so that has implications for how we think of the world, right? Until you realize that, oh, no, most of the world is just I guess trigger alert, the world is way bigger than you are. So you're kind of embedded in it. And so when you're, quote, looking down a small part and you're seeing an emergence, but actually there's way more going on in time and in space. And so we get confused and we go, oh, things just emerge and they're awesome. And it's like, oh, it's not. The things that emerge that last are not like random uncultivated events, right? You don't just like move to a place with a bunch of people and form a country. Like that doesn't work. That might be relevant today, where it definitely isn't working in a number of places, or the continent of Africa, where it doesn't seem to have been working for the past 100 years. There are other examples, but hey, you can challenge me on Africa if you want to lose. That'd be great. You can't just draw lines on a map and call it a country. It doesn't work. If those lines match a culture, which is usually linked pretty strongly to a geography, although not entirely, it might be fine. But like those two things, it's not one thing, right? Those two things have to come together in the right way. That's what everyone's tied in knots about. What do you mean the right way? Sure. Also, like I think the hint here is read the Bible. It'll tell you or something through wisdom, again, through the abstractions. Because right, what you want to do. Paul van der Klee actually talks about this the best. I wish he'd just stick to these sorts of things. Eyes up, eyes down, right? You want to look up at the abstractions and then down at the implementations and see if they match. Because if they don't, then you're not seeing a true thing that's going to last. And yeah, that's a problem. How do I judge? Different question. The first thing is to just practice looking up and down so that you get a sense for whether or not things are coming from above or they just popped out of the ground. So that's the first thing. Because sometimes something will come along and it'll be like a sensation, right? And we might call it a fashion. You don't know that at the time necessarily, right? You see something like Jordan Peterson in the beginning and you're like, I don't know about this guy. Is he for real? Like, is he going to take on the woke establishment and win? Because he did. But at the time, that wasn't clear. Is he going to make any headway with the Canadian government? I mean, he did make some, like he didn't accomplish his goal, we'll say, but like that wasn't clear when it was happening, right? And so you have to use other markers. Now, not to brag, kind of knew that was going to take off. I was there. I was like, oh yeah, this guy, I know what he's up to, and this is good stuff, and he's in alignment with something. We can argue about whether or not he's in proper alignment with what people want, certain people in certain areas, but like the phenomenon is real, obviously, and that was lots of people saw it. Maybe not the people you think would, but lots of people were like, oh yeah, this is going to go places. But that's because the top and the bottom were matching. It wasn't a pure emergence, because lots of guys have since emerged and gone away, for example, right? Or emerged and only risen so high, whereas, Peterson basically fundamentally changed YouTube in some sense. So that's kind of a difference,
Can I add a point about wisdom?
Well, wisdom is the thing that allows you to see that Jordan Peterson's going to be big.
So I'll try to poorly represent Manuel here since he's studying Aristotle. Aristotle has lots of different language about, like, you have the first level of actualization. I don't remember what the other words that he used are always, and then you have like a second order of like manifestation, and you have like these layers where you can build up higher layers of meaning. And he has a set of language and vocabulary for maybe doing that with more precisely. But this week I got into these very dysfunctional conversations about many things. But we live in a time where categories are being destroyed, and I can't use it could be a conversation as simple as is international chess more complex or complicated as opposed to Chinese checkers, for example, or like trying to talk about things in concrete terms, like maybe the difference between tactics and strategy. It's very difficult to establish a concept. So like just to maybe define complex and complicated systems both have many layers of interconnected relationships, but complex systems have more second order effects. So in other words, there's more chaos. It is more difficult to understand the inputs and the effects that they have. Whereas a complicated system, the inputs and the outputs are more predictable, right? Now the layers of how we define, like whether, even fundamental concepts like establishing defining complex or complicated. In conversations like that, people might appeal to, read the definition of complex or read the definition of complicated. And that's kind of an insufficient way to go about understanding these things. You know, you can't boil down all of the connotations and implications of whether when we use the word like tactics or strategy or, you know, whatever, when we use these words, you can't put the full meaning into a set of propositions, you know. And so that's been, you know, so with respect to language about second order effects, you know, it kind of depends what your reference point is. And there's many things that depend upon perspective and things. But, you know, I have found myself, so I'm not really making a point here other than saying that there are philosophical tools that have language to describe these things, but I found myself oftentimes frustrated, you know, agreeing on basic concepts around the subject.
Yeah. Well, and I think again, wisdom is the binding set of abstractions that helps you to understand how the earth is ordered. I think that's part of the point that is trying to be made here.
Well,
I think
based on
wisdom
my
is something like the Platonic form, because it's abstract, it's above, you look up to it, it comes down.
Yeah, because Mark, you said that wisdom would be understanding that Peterson would succeed or something along those lines.
The ability
and
to see that, yeah.
Yeah, and if we look at the image on page 45, that would be more akin to knowledge, and then understanding. I'm not sure how that would map to understanding, but because wisdom is, I feel like in this conversation we're enclosing it and concretizing it a bit too much. It feels like it's supposed to be more abstract, and when he talks in the other chapters about something that's above, it is often not comprehensible. So I don't, how would you use wisdom to know?
So let me do knowledge. Right. So all right. So let me do two things. Let me point out it's not understanding knowledge wisdom. It's not. Like that's the bottom up view. The correct view is whatever you think you have that you call knowledge is not knowledge without wisdom. And so the knowledge that Peterson was going to take off has to be preceded by wisdom. Because the understanding has already, I would argue, I might be wrong about this, Matthieu will correct me if he ever sees this. I would argue the understanding has already been co-manifested by wisdom. I think that's explicit in the text. So I want to drop that there. I want to run real quick to catch up on comments because I've been sloppy, and let you think about
Mark,
that.
do you mind if I pause before you read the comments? So I think one thing that's important to distinguish when thinking about things like wisdom and understanding, if you think about the core thesis of this book is that what's more important is not how something works and what lines you define. I think that the focus that Matthieu Pageau is bringing is why is it important to understand this? Like why is it, and that kind of involves who you are and how you exist in relationship to the things. I think a big part of when it comes to understanding things is starting with the point of why is it important to understand this rather than how does it work.
So Daniel, that brings us right into chapter 14, just so that we don't miss that connection point for when we do get to that later in the conversation.
Right. No,
and then I also wanted to echo what Elena originally said, both by pointing out page 45 as being important in relationship to the earlier pages we've seen. And that should be the same in the digital copy. But please continue.
Okay. Yeah. Let me. I want everybody to think about all that, though. I don't want to. And while you're thinking about that, you can ignore, at least the people here can ignore me answering these quick questions. So, Ethan, cultivating is a feminine action. Yeah. Wisdom traditionally associated with the mother of God or the house of Christ, I believe. You need to spend more time on that. Damn it, Ethan. We need your brilliance. I do miss book clubs with Ethan. Corey McKeon. Would you say that aphorisms are symbolic distillations of wisdom? Probably. Taleb has a book of aphorisms. I'm just saying. I thought that was his best move ever. By the way, I have it. Of course.
I would actually. I think Corey's on the right track with that. Not to interrupt too much.
No, I think that's right. Oh, anybody can interrupt with these. I don't have answers for this necessarily. But yeah, I think that's correct, Corey. I would say yes. I wouldn't die on that sword or anything. I'm open to being convinced. I'm not at all certain, but that sounds right to me. That's how I would have conceived of it if anybody had sort of asked me. So I'll have to agree. If RJ agrees and I agree, it's probably right because we're both wicked smart. Ethan, I think the Greeks will refer to icon of the Annunciation as wisdom. Well, that's an interesting idea. I don't know.
Because when you at the Annunciation, not only is there the seed being dropped into the world, it's also like the knowledge of the seed, right? Because the Annunciation isn't like it's kind of separated from the conception, I think, like in a way. So the Annunciation is the knowledge that precedes the event, sort of.
We'll have to dig into that someday.
That's touching on some pretty close to theological ground,
right?
Which I don't know if any of us are really qualified to make comments on. Though the parallel I will raise up and say is a very important one, and there is a tracking of certain dynamics, whether it's in the philosophy or in the theology, that we certainly can comment on.
I would say, Gustavson, I don't know that much about this at all, but my intuition based on how my patterns work is that there is a pointing to the knowledge, but the knowledge emerges from, right? And in other words, after, all right? Like, and this goes back to things like what is knowing? Well, the biblical idea of knowing, not the, we'll call it age of gnosis idea of knowing, right? We read a book and you know that never happened to you. Don't think that ever happened. All right, you only know by doing. All right, you only know, but which means knowledge does not precede action ever. And I'm gonna die on that hill. So good luck. Good luck.
So this is where the sequence. So this is where the sequencing of things totally generally are important, but also in the. I think if I'm not incorrect, because it's not said explicitly, I think the order of the chapters actually is intentional to try to actually lay this out in the order that it occurs, which is where I pointed to the more kind of axiomatic positing of John Walton's stuff.
Right.
But that's a different book altogether and a different conversation. But it is useful to point out in a discrete way the doubling that we see on the diagrams on page 40, and it's the doubling of 1 to 2, and not from 2 to 3. Where there's a level of where you see 3, you see identity, which we can talk about as having discrete quality.
Yeah. Oh, that's actually a really good point, RJ. Yeah, I wish you were here earlier. Yeah, that's this diagram here.
Right. And that plays into Nebuchadnezzar's statue in the dream.
Right.
And that also, and that I would like to juxtapose that to the image of man and how it becomes tripartite in this particular work. Because those are important pieces.
And when you say identity, you mean a certain specific type of identity, right? Because what the pushback on that would likely be something like, oh, I can identify the air by how it feels on my skin. Or
right, not identifying, identity in a way that is discrete from the category.
Exactly. And it's the 3 that gives you the discretization.
Which is where things get centered on the relationality and the tonos.
There's no relationality between 2. Or there's no discernible relationality between 2. That's the problem.
And where you see 2, you see knowledge and knowing. In the language, when 2 things come together, the euphemism is they knew each other. That's what I'm pointing at.
Yeah.
Not in the discrete sense, but in the poetical vox of the text.
No, that makes sense. All right, let me just continue with the comments here too. So, Ethan, there's definitely a mystery, and I think this is where, quote, sophiology, end quote, comes from, which is not a good thing. I agree. I think the way that sophiology seems to be doing things, and I don't know, super much about it, but it seems to be desacralizing wisdom by bringing it down into a person. And I'm fairly sure that what let's call it the Cathodox position, because Christianity is a stupid word, it means nothing and can never mean anything. The Cathodox position is more like, yeah, that only happened once, and we know what that is, and it's in the book. Go read it. I think that would be the position, but not the best person to represent that. But also, I see a pattern, so I'm going to go with that. All right, back to 13, and RJ, feel free to fill in with your notes, actually, since you were late.
Those were pretty much all of my notes.
Oh, okay. Well, that was.
I mean, the thing I do want to just hold up for just one more moment is the Genesis pattern as the 1 through 9, and that is playing out in a personal way, in a personalized way, in an agentic way in the Garden of Eden. So that's the two pieces here, and we can look at those in diagrams, but the difference between the text as reading yourself into the text, or the text as such, and the diagrams is essentially moving around the contextual axis. So when you have a diagram of something, it's not alive. When you're reading a text, it's a little too alive. So those are the two, and then therefore the three, we ourselves are participating in a sense in that third form, so which allows us to, if we keep that in mind, allows us to see certain things.
Thank you for that. I just flipping through the chapter names. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see what's going on there. I didn't catch that. Thank you. Appreciate that. Twice read over. Totally missed something I would normally be able to pay attention to. That happened in Moby Dick too. So,
well, I would say both texts are about giving people eyes to see, not to slide too far into that lexicon.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, both texts are important. That's why we're doing both book clubs at the same time, to piss me off. I mean, to cause me too much stress or something. Yes. No, I think it was the first one. Never mind. Yeah. So, but yeah, I didn't see that pattern. I don't know why I didn't see the pattern. That's a good one. Probably because I didn't flip through the chat. Well, I looked at the table of contents first, of course, always OCD, but that wouldn't have worked because it wouldn't have resonated until I read it. So I need to read the table of contents again.
But that goes exactly back to the last comment we had as for where we are in the text right now, is the knowledge is inherently participatory.
Yep.
As opposed to Sophia or wisdom. And the programming language, its size of the data set can affect the regression.
Map that a little closer for me.
When you don't have enough data, think about mean, median, mode. When you have more and more data, that will give you a slightly different trend, even if the data is relatively consistent. You actually just have to have that much data to start seeing it.
Yeah. Yes. Adding detail destroys.
Right, and participating through events is something like the acquisition of a greater data set.
Maybe
you can't have wisdom before you have knowledge, in a sense. That's what we were discussing, or I may have switched that. But you can't identify the trend without having acquired the data.
Yeah, but I think it's important to understand that the quality of experiences of a fundamental different quality than more information, right? I mean, I just think it's important to just note that.
No, there's no overlap. Information is not qualitative. I mean, it's not qualitative. It's only quantitative, and that's the problem.
Right. What I'm pointing at is the relationship, but the difference and distinction of knowledge and wisdom,
right,
and the inaccessibility of wisdom from knowledge alone. You have to have enough knowledge.
Right. And I want to highlight this, Corey McKeon, empiricism versus theory, earth versus heaven. I'm going to neither confirm nor deny. I'm just going to drop that there and say, well, that was a comment that someone made. Manuel is back. Yay.
So in the language of the text, I should rephrase. You need to have worked out enough of the manifested fractal nature to then begin to see unity again. So there's like
going back
to maybe page 42. the way that those 4 levels work out, you don't see that, and you can't see all 4 levels in just the top level. So
Right.
that has an analog to thinking about certain types of math. That's all I was saying.
I am glad you brought that up. Actual thought I had earlier today, way before reading the book, was that one of the confusions of a model like the Neoplatonic model is that people keep saying, well, because self-similar fractal, the one is contained in the many, and therefore if I know any single many, this is always weird, but also what this is what they say. I'm not making this up. They always say this in some way or another. Then I know the one, and therefore problem solved. And I'm like, no, that's, you can't, because you have a single instance, and even in the Neoplatonic so-called, because there's no such thing as Neoplatonism, idea, that wouldn't work. Like the one is the instantiation of all the manys, and so having access to one of the manys does not. It only gives you one aspect of the one, not the whole thing, right? It's very individualistic and single perspectival, and that's actually why they do that trick, because science is single perspectival at the end of the day. Also, Neoplatonism is a lie. Don't believe them. Just assume they're lying. It's better.
Did we already mention that, like, that literal graph was in the Wisdom of Hypatia?
No, I wasn't going to drag Wisdom of Hypatia in this, but we could grab the Wisdom of Hypatia, and yeah, there's a lot of parallels in that book. Yeah, I wasn't thinking along those lines at all. I don't want to link. It's too bad. Like, some of that book is great, and the rest of it is complete and utter fantasy garbage. So it's very sad. Very useful book, but.
So we're talking about a lot of concepts and distinguishing between the two, which I think is useful. I think some people have kind of been over this territory more versus less, but I guess what I would like to gain, because I know we're kind of running out of time, but I would like to just sort of ask the question of when it comes to practical disagreement over basic perspectives on, we could use any example we want. Are there tactics or strategies or tools or ways of thinking that can help, that people have found that can help make conversations more productive in terms of coming to common ground over concepts? Because the way that concepts are, what would be some things that can help? Huh?
Do you want the answer? It's having the wisdom to know that person's lost and you're never going to convert them, and you just need to not talk to them anymore. And that's very sad.
That's a big part of it. Like Peterson talks about this in terms of, like, when you're in a conversation and you find that you're not where you think you are, you should stop talking and watch them like a hawk. Because what it means is that you're not talking to who you think you're talking to. You're talking to something else, right?
You're talking to a possessed creature. Yeah.
And so if you look at, like, for example, how, like, in the Republic, for example, how Plato interacts with, like, Muppets, like Glaucon, for example, there's lots of things that he does where he kind of plays dumb and asks questions and says, gets you to kind of, gets Glaucon to put forward an argument, for example, or whatever, and say, okay, you define the term, and then I'll go with that, and I'll lead you to its end, and I have lots of tools for showing you, like throwing up walls and showing you the limitations of such things. But I don't know, it's like to the point where it's almost like almost everything I consume and read and watch, it's almost as though there's no wisdom in anything. People are talking so much from their head.
Right. Wisdom isn't talking. There's no wisdom in speech. There's no wisdom in books. It's not there. I'm sorry. It's not there.
I would like to point out something that I do think this book tries to point out to a certain degree as well as in many other places, that, and the phrase is, truth does not live in a book. And it's a very specific word choice.
Yep.
And there's a certain tension even trying to relay these images in a book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and truth doesn't live in understanding either.
Right. That's right.
Like I was actually having a conversation earlier today, right? And like I'm talking to this guy, and like he's saying the right spirit, but he's using the wrong words, and I'm just like, I thought I'd argue with him, and I was like, no, I wouldn't use these words. Like I get where you're going. I agree that what you're seeing exists basically, but I wouldn't use these words because these words keep you locked. And like you don't even have to expand on that, right? You just have to say yes, but no. Unless it's actually no, and then you can just deal with no.
When that's Peterson's "don't use the language of your enemies," which I extremely agree with, right? And if they hijack yours, beat them with the correction until they give up. That's what I do. And you can be upset about that or whatever, but A, it works, and B, you don't have a better option. So I don't know, man. Right? Or disengage. You can always disengage, right? It's not your job to save the world. It's not your job to fix everybody else. It's not. The best thing you can do is try to be wise yourself, or try to get as much wisdom into you as you can, or something. And that's the best that you can do. But also, it's enough. Like, doing that is also enough. Right? You're not going to save the world. You're not going to pull somebody out of their drug addiction. You're not, none of those things are going to happen. And certainly not with words, right? But what might work is you exemplifying the right answer, or exemplifying a wise life. And in fact, John Vervaeke, to his credit, and he says this in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, he says, well, we don't need everybody to be more wise. Right. But we need more wise people. Why? Well, because they can exemplify for the rest of the people. That's actually what's important. And which, at one point sounds like a treaty to not be wise yourself, right? Well, we don't need everybody to be more wise, right? But actually is the opposite. It's basically focusing you in on you. Right? What can you do to make the world a better place? Right? Not what can you do to fix somebody else, because that's not an option that's available to you directly, right? You do that basically by accident, is how I want to phrase it.
And that would be knowledge, right?
No, I don't. I'm not a big fan of knowledge, actually. Not knowledge as action in the world, sure. Right. But not knowledge as we typically use the word. And that's the problem. And that is very much what the book's trying to do, get you out of we'll call it the modern errors idea of knowledge, or what I call the age of gnosis idea of knowledge, right? Which is knowledge as propositions. John Vervaeke refers to this as propositional tyranny. I don't know that it exactly maps, but it's way close enough, right? The propositional idea of knowledge is bankrupt. Right. I already hinted at this, right? Like, you don't have knowledge until an action has been taken. You can't get knowledge by reading a book. It's not possible. You only get knowledge by implementing what the book communicated to you. And a lot of what we call knowledge is just communication. The problem with that is that if somebody communicates to you that they're a good person, and then they turn out to be a serial killer, what knowledge did you have exactly? Right? If somebody tells you somebody, is that somebody is not in fact taking your stuff while they're taking your stuff, like, where's the knowledge exactly? Is it in the communication of the lie, right? And how do we determine a lie? We determine a lie based on knowledge. No, you determine a lie based on observation and experience. You never determine a lie based on statements. Anybody can make any statement about anything. And that's where people get confused. Oh, they said, we were in the modern era, and then we were in the postmodern era, and now we're in the metamodern era. Right? That's gobbledygook garbage that cannot convey communicative, informative value to anyone ever, under any circumstances. Now, you can map that to something yourself, and that mapping isn't wrong. That's what
I was gonna let's put that in, right? So what is a proper place for knowledge? Well, if you have a purpose, right? Like if you have a telos, right? Knowledge can build a structure to achieve the telos, right? And so now it gets meaning, right? Like it inherits meaning by how it is participating in the telos. And if you look at it that way, right? Okay, so like there's this thing that drags it and fills it up, inflates it in some sense, right? And if you start learning things without that, right? Like if you try to attain knowledge without a telos, then it is meaningless, right? Like it doesn't have a way to participate with you. And so when you live in the illusion that is the case, right? That knowledge does participate with you in whatever, because like, oh look, I now understand why they put Biden up on the stage, because like I have knowledge, right? It's like no, like you don't have a way to participate with that. Like that's just a way for you to calm down, because now you find intelligibility, and like the thing that happened isn't as scary anymore. Because if there wasn't a good reason why he's up there, then the world would be really a lot more messier than you'd like it to be. And so this the way that information can be used is really diverse, right? And you could say, well, is it used in helping you attain something good, or is it used for another purpose, right? And like and at that point it doesn't even matter what the purpose is, because like now it's misguided, right? Like and
I want to let me just strengthen that. So Ethan had already said this is why until 500 years ago all reading was preceded by invoking a spirit. Then I will do a hats off, full credit to Manuel, because the thing that you know he in particular highlighted in our discoveries over these past like 4.5, 5 years, whatever it's been, is you have to set an intention in order to relate to the text. That's why we do the book clubs in that particular format, even though I do it poorly. Manuel's the expert there. So Corey, I'm going to address this. It's a dynamical feedback process. No, there is one, but it is not one. You have to have enough experience to have a place for the knowledge. The experience generates the knowledge, dude. Then the knowledge lands. Now the experience is the thing that lands the knowledge. And then you go have more experiences. Okay, expand your worldview slightly, sir, and say if you add communication and you add participation into that equation, then the dynamical system actually works and makes sense and isn't self-referencing, and all these things are resolved. Now, you can shoot back and say that's too complicated or too complex, or I can't do that. All of those are fair. Maybe then, right? Maybe if there's something you can't understand in the world, and there's lots of things I have no chance of understanding in the world, then maybe don't try. Just kind of accept, oh, there's more here that I can track, right? Because this is the problem. People have been told they can do things that they cannot do. Like, oh, I can understand why they put a senile old man in a debate. No, you can't. There's so many factors that went into that, and I don't know what any of them are actually. Like I literally, I'm like, what are any of these people thinking? But I was that way 4 years ago, like, or 5 years ago, really. Like this, I'm like, what have you guys been doing all this time? Like, are you all nuts? This is not going to end well. It's like I said that on my live stream last night. Like I knew a long time ago, well, this is going to end well, no matter what happened. It doesn't make a difference. And the question is, what was their rationale? I'm a pragmatist. I don't assume I can understand somebody else's rationale without a lot of data and some very specific types of data, usually relating to their actions in the world and having nothing to do with anything they ever spoke in their lives or written, which is really key, right? Like trust observation over propositional communication. Like once you do that, you have a way to participate in the experience that creates the knowledge. Because if you have the experience and you don't participate, the knowledge doesn't manifest, right? And the communication may point your attention at an experience or at a way to experience or at a way to participate. All of that can happen, but that's different from the actual knowledge. And it's not a dynamical system in that way.
That dynamic, the separation there is also played out between intention and practicum.
Yes. And
that is also what I personally see in part as being diagrammed in some of these diagrams that we'll see in the next session here. Specifically, when you see the circle inside the circles and then it's cut in half, there is a certain challenge certainly from a pragmatist point of view, of not being able to necessarily divine from specifically and only action or specifically and only language, but when taken together, there is a possible avenue with which to deduce certain things in quality about the intention, and that's not necessarily discreetly achievable as an individual, but that's where language and dialogue come in.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
sorry.
absolutely. Go ahead, Danny.
My phone battery might die pretty soon here, and we're also running late. But I just wanted to preach one thing real quick. So the concept, the theme of you cannot steer a couch potato is all over the Bible. And when we crystallize concepts like knowledge in a having mode as a sort of thing that you can possess, it has a different effect than having the perspective more of like a lot of the stories in the Bible are about getting moving and course correcting. And we've seen from these chapters how fundamental the definitions of wisdom and understanding and knowledge are much more participatory instead of propositional or other things. And holding those more crystallized definitions for these fundamental concepts, I think, can really limit your ability to relate to stories and people.
Well said, Danny.
Yeah, I got a request. I think I want to do the request, and then
you want to do the whoops, sorry. There we go. You want to do the request?
Well, so I had a conversation about, well, like 2 + 2 = 4, whatever, right? Like that's an eternal truth, and that therefore it's good or whatever. And it's like, no, because like you can spend time on 2 + 2 = 4, and you can think about it for forever, and like that's not good. You thinking about 2 + 2 = 4 is a distraction from doing other things, right? Now, you thinking about 2 + 2 = 4 while wanting to do something that requires 2 + 2 is good, right? And so there's this really interesting thing, right, where this thing, right, like this abstract reality that's like this source of good according to like a lot of people, right, is not good, right? Like it's not good by itself, right? It only gets good by being placed in service for something good, right? Because you could also argue that 2 + 2 = 4 is used for the atom bomb or whatever, right? Like or by Napoleon when he was calculating the Henry orbits or whatever, right? So yeah, like these things, right? Like that seem good because we like, how would you say 2 + 2 = 4 is bad, right? It doesn't get grip on this abstract thing, right? But it's the participation that we have with it that fills in whether it's participating in the good or the bad, right? And so yeah, I think that's a really important lesson, right? So we had a maxim, curate the information, right? That your signal that you take up, but it's also curate your attention. If you're attending to things wrongly or too much, right, like out of balance, then you also get deformed as a consequence. So yeah.
I think we've beaten that horse to death many times, but I hope it was helpful to people. I think it was. I hope so. It was helpful to me to have to articulate some of this stuff, and I really, RJ's really helping, and Danny as well to contribute. And anybody have anything else? And then Manuel, you can close this out if we, once we're done here.
Right. So I guess I'll slowly close things out. So I want everybody to recall their intention. If Mark maybe people set them, because I don't know.
I did the right thing.
And use that intention to reflect on your participation, see points of success or actual points of failure. Also reflect on things that stood out to you emotionally or like intellectually, and maybe make some notes about the things that you want to take into the week with you. And after we've evaluated, we want to set an intention for the week so that we can come back next week with an integrated story. So yeah, everybody take a moment. I want to leave us with homework till chapter 20 for next week.
Great.
And yeah, I'll try to lead it more in the future to get more flesh on this intention business.
Yeah.
So yeah, see everybody on the stream, and see you next week.